One of the things that I've noticed as a social scientist is that racist violence has been proliferating across the country, and particularly in the South. And it's assumed a number of forms. One form that we see is attacks against black elected officials. Another form that we're seeing is, again, the reemergence of lynching. Less than 25 or 28% rather of all blacks who attend college go to the 107 traditionally black colleges in this country. But something in excess of 42% of all black graduates every year come out of those schools. If you take a look at black doctors in this country, 75% of all black medical doctors have graduated from black institutions. 80% of all black dentists, 75% of all black attorneys come out of black institutions. Black schools are being eradicated. The state schools are losing their money. The private schools are being forced into bankruptcy. And the federal government and so many progressives are doing nothing about it. I really try to take seriously the challenge of what progressive politics is, which is winning a majority of American people to a reorganization of the state and the economy and creating a society that is fundamentally more humane, a society that eradicates unemployment, that eradicates war, that eradicates patriarchy, and that eradicates racism.
A journalist appearing in over 130 newspapers in the country, the director of racial relations at Fisk University, with us tonight on Alternative Views.
Good evening. Welcome to Alternative Views. Our special guest tonight is Marable, who's an author, who's a syndicated columnist, whose writings on politics, economics, and black issues is in 135 newspapers all over the United States and Great Britain. He's the director of the Race Relations Institute at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, and he's the national vice chairman of the Democratic Socialist Alliance. Today with us for this interview are some representatives of the news station, radio station in Austin, KAZI-FM. We have Jay Johnson with us, who's the program director, Karen Polk, who's the news coordinator, and Rosalind Carr, who's a member of their teen staff. So welcome all of you to Alternative Views. Manning, part of your political work has been educational in the broadest sense. You've been director of the Race Relations Institute at Fisk, and you've also written a political column. Can you tell a little bit about that and some of the newspapers it's in, and something about the black press in America that I don't think we know too much about?
Well, one of the things that concerned me when I was in high school was trying to respond to the great changes that occurred, that were occurring in American society, and particularly for black young people. When I was 15, I started writing for a black newspaper. I was not a very original kid. They asked me to write a youth column, so I wrote a column called Youth Speaks Out, because I was a youth and I was speaking out, right? Real bright. Anyway, so I started writing this newspaper, and when I went to college, I started working on a radio program, and I was a DJ. And when I got through grad school, I continued to write for newspapers, giving them a variety of pieces on political commentary. Around 1975, it began to occur to me that the bulk of the black political analysis that was in black media was dreadful. I looked at Carl Rowan, and I looked at Joe Black, the vice president of Greyhound, and I said, my God, I can write better than these jerks, right? So I started writing. And it was, you know, it was really chaotic at first. A newspaper would ask me for a piece, so I would write it up and give it to them. Then somebody else would ask me for a piece, so I'd write up another thing and I'd give it to them. So finally I began to get my stuff together, and I began to coordinate the column on a weekly and then a monthly basis. So by '76 I started writing 5 columns a month, and the deal is, this is something I learned a long time ago, community newspapers and black newspapers always need copy. I give them an offer they can't refuse. The offer is this: I'll write a political commentary for you, and it's absolutely free. The only thing I ask for is a copy of the newspaper. I want a sub, and I want to get a sense of what's going on in your community. So I want to maintain dialogue and a contact with that community. So what happens now is that the column began to grow. So finally, by the end of 1982, we were in, now it's approximately anywhere from 135 to 150 papers. The number changes about every 3 months or so. We go through them. The papers are in the black community in London. Occasionally they're in Africa. They are in about 30 states in the country. Most of the columns are carried in newspapers in California, the Southeast rather, the eastern part of the Midwest, and in the eastern seaboard states. I get all kinds of letters from people. About every 3 months I get a death threat. Thanks, U.S. government. Just kidding. I get all kinds of attacks from different people. I get people who ask me to figure out how I can write their term papers for them. But sometimes I get letters from people that are extraordinary. I got a letter last week from the sister in East Orange, New Jersey. And she told me that for the last 6.5 years, she has clipped out every single column I have written that has appeared in the Afro-American newspaper. And she has it in 2 huge scrapbooks. Right? And it really makes you feel good because you're beginning to reach at a grassroots level. And my argument is, now we're in all these newspapers. We figured out that we get read by about 5 million people a week.
Wow.
And people keep saying that it's impossible to be a progressive and reach a mass-based audience, and that's ridiculous. You can do it. And it's quite simple. Just speak in a language people understand. You don't beat people over the head with rhetoric, but you cut through the day-to-day crap that the society and the state force down upon people's heads. What I try to do is carry out a strategy politically that was described by theorist Antonio Gramsci, that the struggle for socialism is a struggle for hegemony in advanced capitalist society. And what we have to do is crack what he would call the common sense of capitalism. I tell this to my students all the time. The reason I write newspapers is because people read newspapers and they have a world view, a way of viewing things. They say things like, you can't fight City Hall. Well, what does that mean? You can't take on the system. They say the more things change, the more they stay the same, you know, quoting Voltaire. They say, or whoever it was, Montesquieu, they say, you know, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. These kinds of truisms, which are basically true under monopoly capitalism, is the glue that holds together the forces of oppression within the culture, the popular terrain of society, the day-to-day life of people. What I try to do through my column is to crack through the hegemony and to provide an alternative common sense. So that, for example, when I went down to Miami, Florida, during the Miami Rebellion, people met me on the street, and they might not have known my name, but they knew my face from reading the Miami Times, the black newspaper there, Dade County. So one brother stopped me on the street, you know, during the rebellion, and he said, yo, I know you. I said, oh yeah, you do? He said, yeah, you Mr. Grassroots. I said, that's right, brother. And we started, you know, talking, right? And he was able to put me in touch with all these people who were carrying on the rebellion. And I got to find out how things were done, who was doing what, and it became a piece that I wrote in the Black Scholar, in my column, and then later in my book, Blackwater. Mm. So it's the column that is the cutting edge of my political practice and praxis, theory and action.
I want to ask you about the black press, though. people usually either don't think about it or just dismiss it as something which doesn't exist. And it surprised me to hear, for instance, that you were in that many newspapers, because I made a study of the newspapers in Austin, all the newspapers, and back in the early 70s there was a progressive black press, a progressive brown press, along with the establishment black and brown press, but it wasn't too long before the progressive press folded because of economic problems.
That's right.
Apparently it's alive and well in other parts of the country.
Well, it's alive, but it's not quite well.
Oh.
The number of black newspapers has declined by about half in the last 30 years in this country. And the dilemma is the same dilemma that all mom and pop type businesses have, that they get pushed out of business by the corporate backed newspapers. I was in Orlando, Florida just yesterday, and people told me that both black and white community papers were being pushed out of business because the main newspaper in Miami, which is owned by the Chicago Tribune, has developed several mini papers which have now compete on a 3 times a week basis inside of the neighborhoods surrounding the periphery of Orlando, so that it pushes out the small mom and pop type newspaper operations. Most black newspapers are very small. There are no more than roughly 25 major black papers in this country, and even most of those, there are no more than about 4 or 5 blacks newspapers that come out more than once a week. But the newspapers do provide a vehicle for information and for political discussion. I don't expect people to read my column every week. I do expect people to read the column once every month or once every other month, and it stays in people's homes. And that's really important because, like, I get a lot of letters from students, high school, students, asking me about something I had written. And I really make an earnest effort to try to break down what a lot of people on the left would, in a very elitist way, say are very complicated issues in a very common sense way. I really try to take seriously the challenge of what progressive politics is, which is winning a majority of American people to a reorganization of the state and the economy, and creating a society that is fundamentally more humane, a society that eradicates unemployment, that eradicates war, that eradicates patriarchy, and that eradicates racism. The only way we can do that is to have an ongoing discourse with the majority of American people, because socialism is, as we used to say, not going to fall out of the sky. It's going to be built right here with the human building blocks, which are working and poor people. And they live in neighborhoods. We got to reach them.
You are active, are you not, in the Democratic Socialist Alliance movement. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, let me make one minor correction.
Okay.
DSA is the Democratic Socialist of America. It is a political organization of people on the Democratic left who are committed to a progressive transformation of the political economy in this country in order to guarantee certain basic rights for working and poor people. We believe very strongly that no one should go hungry in this country, that no one should live in dilapidated housing, that no one should be deprived the right to a decent job, that American capitalism, the way it's structured, places the interests of the wealthy ahead of the interests of poor and working people. We argue that corporate capitalism in this country is designed to maximize profits, and it places profits ahead of people. We argue that the democratic reorganization of the economy is imperative so that people can be before profits. The members of the Democratic Socialists of America came together in March of 1982 from 2 different organizations. One was the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, DSOC, which was founded in 1972 by Michael Harrington, who is probably best known for his book, The Other America, which was responsible for, in large measure, for establishing the war on poverty 20 years ago. DSOC came out of the fractures in what once constituted the old Socialist Party. Many of the people in DSOC are active within the Democratic Party. A number of members of DSOC are, or were at that time, Ron Dellums, the congressperson from California, Julian Bond of Atlanta, a number of trade unionists, Bill Lucey, William Wimpesinger of the Machinist Union, a number of feminist leaders, Barbara Ehrenreich, a variety of people, primarily from the trade unions in the Democratic Party, electoral politics. NAM merged with DSOC. The New American Movement was a political organization that emerged out of what was once called the New Left of the 1960s. NAM's character was very different from DSOC's in the sense that most of the people tended to be younger. They came off of colleges in the 1960s. They were involved in civil rights work, feminist organizations, gay rights work, activism within the communities, grassroots mobilization. This was the first time in recent memory that two major left organizations merged in this country. The history of the left is really a history of splits. And by coming together, as of today, DSOC and NAM merging into DSA is now the largest democratic left organization in the country. We have in excess of 7,500 members. Mike Harrington is the chair. I am one of several vice chairs. And our task, as we see it, is at some point in the near future to place socialism on the American agenda.
Isn't there a real problem of bringing those two groups together, and even now, the fact that DSOC was working within the Democratic Party? They considered them at the left part of the spectrum of the Democratic Party, whereas the NAM people were working outside the party. And now they still, when they came together in this one organization, they still consider themselves within the Democratic Party. Isn't that terribly limiting? Because they never get anything, not even crumbs from the Democrats.
Well, I think that that's a trifle sectarian. And I say that as a representative of the left wing of this organization. Let's be realistic. One of the problems we have in America's political apparatus is that, unlike other so-called democracies, there are a number of structural factors that limit the ability for progressives to develop independent political organizations. Bill Dimhoff, the political scientist, a number of other people have talked about this. First off, America's electoral system is executive-oriented rather than legislative-oriented. In other words, decisions tend to be made from the top down and not with adequate input from the legislative branches of government. A critical problem, too, is that the executives are elected separately from the representatives. In the UK, Peggy Thatcher is not elected by all of the British people. She's elected by the Parliament, and she is the representative of the majority party in Parliament. In the Knesset in Israel, when people run for office, slates are run so that if you receive 1% of the vote in this country, inside of Israel, for example, you receive one or that proportion of seats in the legislature. In this country, if you run for Congress in a district, you get 49% of the votes in a two-way race. The number of seats you get is 0. So you've got a built-in factor in America's electoral system that eliminates, or at least makes it extraordinarily difficult for third parties to operate effectively in gaining some kind of legitimacy at even a grassroots level.
Yet, Manning, you've argued recently in an article in these Times that perhaps some of the left in America should start thinking seriously about third-party building.
Exactly. In saying all of these things, by no means am I saying that independent politics cannot work. I'm simply pointing out the structural limitations inside of this system. Now, recognizing the limitations, I think that progressives need to put forward what I would term an inside-outside strategy. On the inside of the Democratic Party, there are a number of progressives who are nominally Democrats, but for all practical purposes, I think it would be deleterious to the left to run candidates against Ron Dellums, Julian Bond, Harold Washington of Chicago, and a number of other progressives who have been elected across the country. Simply to say that they are Democrats doesn't mean that they don't have the legitimate interests of the progressives within that community. But even in saying that, I would also insist that wherever the logistical possibility exists to run independent candidates, we on the left need to take advantage of that. There are a variety of instances that I think a lot of people, even inside my own organization, have been much too reticent. We can see in 1980, for example, in the state of Mississippi, a friend of mine, Les McLemore, political science professor at the University of Jackson State University, ran for the Congress in the 1st District and polled 29.7% of the vote. He did this in a three-way race. He did this without any money. He did this only with organizing with students and community people and in a very short period of time. And running against a white Republican and a white Democrat, he was able to win almost 30% of the vote and coming in a close second.
That's incredible.
So these kinds of things can work if you have a stable base of either third world voters. For example, there are 37 or 38 districts in this country that have 40% or more third world people in congressional districts. Any kind of district like that, we seriously need to analyze whether an independent race can work. And looking at the data from Jackson, Mississippi, where you have cultural conservatism and an intense political repression, it obviously was successful in this case. Now, I don't mean to extrapolate from an isolated case, but I think we need to seriously analyze where independent politics can work. We need to seize the time on it. So all I'm suggesting here is we need to recognize the limitations, also understanding that there are within the Democratic Party, given the fact of its great breadth and contradictions, there is a tendency in the Democratic Party that represents the interest of working and poor people. But the bulk of the Democratic Party cannot be a vehicle to provide health care, welfare, social services, full employment, and peace for working and poor people and third world people and oppressed nationalities in this country. So we have to look at independent strategies. We have no other choice.
Well, you know, socialism has a bad name in this country, not only because of the press saying socialism is bad all these years, but because countries which call themselves socialist have had horrible records of repression, like the Soviet Union, for instance.
That's true. But on the other hand, I think we need to look at several things. One of the problems that socialism has had historically is that it evolved in the weakest links of capitalism and imperialism, so that when socialism was developed after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, that people in Russia, or what became the Soviet Union, were trying to find models of what kind of society, what socialism meant, and people did not know. Part of the root problem lies with Marx, and I know you teach Marxist philosophy, but, I mean, Marx writes this massive book, and he doesn't call it socialism, he calls it what? Capital, right? It's a critique. If you look at all of Marx's stuff, what is it? It's a critique of what is. Marx was really reticent about talking about what is the nature of the society that we need to be creating, okay? And for a lot of good reasons. I mean, who wants to unite with a metaphysician? But the problem was for people like, no, I'm serious. Problem for people like the Bolsheviks was, how do you build a socialist society? And so they started, you know, in a very helter-skelter way, trying to pull together all these nuts and bolts. And they took some of the best features of what they thought socialism should be, and they picked up a lot of bad habits and really terrible things from the West. Picked up Taylorism. They picked up, you know, like piecemeal work and tried to get assembly line stuff.
Managers.
Exactly, all this terrible stuff, right?
Overlaid with what was left from the old Tsar system, like the secret police and terrorism. Yeah.
Exactly. So to a large, this is not to justify or to explain away what happened there, but it is to place it within some kind of historical context. Now, in this country, the biggest problem I think you have is not that we don't have a material base for socialism. If we had socialism in this country, the democracy, and by my definition of socialism, I don't mean anything like what I see over in the Soviet Union. What I think about as socialism is fundamentally public ownership of the central mode of production, the democratization of the workplace. In other words, people who produce the wealth ought to have the direct and final say on how things are produced and distributed, and they ought to own the basic things that come out of this society. I also think it means a principled ongoing struggle against the systems, the structures of oppression, such as patriarchy, racism, and I think you have to tackle these kinds of these kinds of structures that are a separate struggle, although at times symbiotic, but a separate struggle from simply a class struggle in a very narrow sense. And I would also argue that as we develop a socialist society in this country, we have the material basis for it today. The biggest hassle I've run into as a political organizer is ideology. People basically live in a society that is so culturally dominated by individuality and by materialism, and people think of individual success. In fact, let me very briefly tell you a story. When I went to grad school, I went to the University of Maryland at College Park, and it was a big deal. I was the first person in my family to get a doctorate, right? And my mom, I love my mom, but my mom and I had political struggles. Mom flew out like from our home to College Park and stood outside the door waiting for me so she could be the first person to see Dr. Marable walk out, right? So I came out of the door after defending my dissertation, and she said, "Son, did you cross the River Jordan?" You know, biblical, right? So it was understandable. And I said, "Yeah, Mom, I made it to the other side." Tears came in her eyes. She said, "Son, I'm so proud of you." She thought a minute. She began to conjure up a vision of success for Manning, right? She said, "Just think, 10 years from today, you can become a black Henry Kissinger." So what could I say? I said, "Mom, that is exactly what I do not intend to become." Right? But that's what I mean by capitalist ideology. And that's what infiltrates in people's consciousness. And you have to fight against that. That's what Amilcar Cabral, the African revolutionist, used to say. The biggest struggle is not against our oppressors. The biggest struggle is against our own weaknesses, our own contradictions. That's what we have to overcome.
Manning, you were talking about struggles, and a lot of people would say, well, the blacks have made a lot of strides in the past few years, and they have. They point to black sheriffs down south, black mayors down south occasionally. But you have come up with a horror story, which I read a few weeks ago, about what happened to a mayor in a small Mississippi town. Can you tell us about that, and then broaden it into what is happening to other black elected officials in the South or elsewhere?
Yes, it's a terrifying story. I'm sure that a lot of people who are listening and seeing this will already know about the case of Eddie Carthen.
It's received no publicity except in the alternative press, the left press.
Well, that's, yeah,
So
keep in mind we live in America. There's no such thing as real free press. It's free if you have the capital. It's free if you have the money. In Mississippi, you have a situation where Eddie Carthen is a black man. He was elected mayor of a small town in the Delta part of Mississippi, Chula, Mississippi. The town had less than 3,000 people. 2/3 of them were on welfare. Over 37% were unemployed. Over 81% of the housing was dilapidated. This was a town that was dominated by big white planters who lived out in the rural areas, who controlled the cotton. That was the major agricultural form of production. And also by the town businessmen. These are people in the South that we call the good old boys. I mean, they run the town, they tell the niggers what to do, etc. Well, Eddie Carthen got elected mayor as a fluke, right? The whites didn't really mobilize effectively because they just taken for granted. They'd been running the society for 100 years, ever since slavery was over. Carthen became mayor, and some of the local good old boys went to him and said, "Look, Eddie, if you play ball with us, we're going to give you $10,000 under the table. Now, you just take the money, and you don't do anything." Eddie rejected it. He said, "I'm not going to take your money. I'm here to help the community." He brought in federal money, millions of dollars. He built a recreation center. He created 80 new jobs, did a variety of things, everything that the good old boys did not want him to do. So what happened to Carthen? First, the whites and the conservative blacks, who were the stooges for the white power structure, controlled the town council. So they began blocking Eddie. They cut his salary from $600 a month to $60 a month.
The council to do this to the mayor?
Yes.
That's a strange formula.
That's right, $600 a month to $60 a month. They refused to pay the town workers who were black for 2 months. They raised the property taxes of the black supporters of Eddie in the town and lowered the property taxes for those people who didn't support Eddie. They poisoned his well. They killed his dog. They did a variety of things. They phoned his wife up in the middle of the night over 100 times and said Eddie's been killed. They did a variety of things. Finally, to make a long story short, there were a series of legal suits that were made between Eddie Carthen and the whites in town. The two cases that stand out were when the town council, the former sheriff, white sheriff, resigned. Eddie appointed, using the powers of the mayor's office, appointed a black man to be the interim sheriff. The town council refused to accept this, and so illegally, without bonding or without having the man take an oath of office, they appointed an old white former sheriff to take over the mayor's office. He pulled his revolver out and told Eddie he was taking over as mayor, and if he took one step closer to him, he would kill him. This is a man, a white police officer, who was not a police officer at all. It's a former police officer. Eddie Carthen brought 6 other black men back. They stripped the gun from him. The white man sued the 7 blacks, charging them with assaulting the police chief of Chula. It goes to court, right? Webb Franklin, who is a conservative Republican, is the judge. And Webb says, you niggers are guilty. And he gives the 6 black men a $1,000 fine and suspended sentence of 3 years. Now this is a case of simple, this is not a felony, technically. This is a misdemeanor, yeah, simple misdemeanor. However, for Eddie Carthen, for a simple misdemeanor, they fine him $3,000 and they give him 3 years in the state penitentiary for the first offense. 3 years in the state penitentiary. The first time in Mississippi history that anybody, black or white, for a misdemeanor on a first offense gets the joint, as they say. All right? Webb Franklin goes on and runs successfully as a congressperson from this district in Mississippi, and he was the man who defeated Bob Clark, the black man who had an excellent shot at becoming congressman. You know what Webb Franklin, this former judge, you know what his campaign slogan was? Vote for Webb Franklin. He's one of us. I'm serious. He's one of us.
And then that wasn't the worst.
That wasn't the worst.
No, the worst was yet to come for Carthen.
Basically what happened is the government wanted him out of the way. And so...
By this you mean state government?
The state government. The state government. So they basically, one of Eddie Carthen's political opponents was killed in a robbery. Later, the evidence shows that the guy who was killed was a front for the cocaine traffic in that part of the South. But in any event, the guys who killed this guy turned state's evidence and said, yes, we killed him, but Eddie Carthen made us do it. Eddie Carthen said, wait a minute, how could I pay you $10,000 to kill this guy when I'm already up in hock because I don't have any money? I'm being sued by the government, by these other people. The murderers told the jury that, well, we didn't get any money from Carthen, but it was an IOU. We would kill him and then we'd get paid later on. Have you ever heard of an IOU murder?
And they believed that. And they wanted to believe it.
Oh, of course.
Right.
The next thing that happened that was bizarre is that...
So they convicted him of murder?
Well, no, let me go on.
Oh, okay.
So the court case starts. The judge, I'm called as a expert witness. The judge and the defense lawyers have to establish that Eddie's case is part of a pattern of racist violence and attacks against black elected officials. They asked me basically to testify in court that there is a history of racism in Mississippi. Right?
You had to prove that?
I had to prove it.
They needed a scholar.
That's right. Well, to make a long story short, the case was won by Eddie when we were able, the defense attorneys were able to get, for the first time in Mississippi history, an all-black jury. We challenged the whites who were who wanted to get on the jury. The defense attorneys would ask the whites, well, have you ever used the word nigger? And one of the white women who wanted to be a juror said, I don't see what that has to do with this trial. Of course, everybody uses the word nigger. Throw her out, right? Anyway, so Eddie won that. but he's still in the penitentiary on these other 2 offenses. And so the struggle continues.
Has this ever received coverage on the national news networks, on 60 Minutes or anything?
Very small coverage. It has been picked up by the New York Times. But what's also interesting is that one major church that became involved in supporting Eddie Carthen, some of their staffers have been dismissed because they gave church money to the Carthen case. Other kinds of struggles have been occurring. A smear tactic has gone on. Supposedly, well, the Jackson major newspaper did a story on Eddie that was character assassination. Ostensibly, in an objective news analysis essay, one reporter wrote, "Eddie Carthen is a humbug and a fraud, the likes of which have not been seen since P.T. Barnum." That was supposedly objective news. Of course, down in Jackson, Mississippi, it is.
But wasn't there a progressive newspaper down there, or at least a newspaper in Jackson, that did write an article favorable to Eddie, and then that...
Oh, tell them... Well, what happened was, the Jackson Advocate is one of the best black newspapers in the country. They wrote several articles in favor of Eddie Carthen, and their offices were firebombed twice.
Now, is this an unusual the case, or has there been a lot of violence against
I wish
blacks?
I could say that this has been unusual, but it's not. One of the things that I've noticed as a social scientist is that racist violence has been proliferating across the country, and particularly in the South. And it's assumed a number of forms. One form that we see is attacks against black elected officials. Another form that we're seeing is, again, the reemergence of lynching. In Mississippi alone last year, there were 12 lynchings in the state that have been established. In Georgia.
Which are whites hanging up blacks?
Yeah, basically. Or blacks being lynched, and no one knows who did it. Right. In Georgia, back in 1976, my wife's brother, Michael Edgerton, was the first black police officer in Walton County, Georgia. Now, there were 9 lynchings in Walton County since 1946. Michael was attacked. Robbie, his wife, was phoned up, and she was told that he had been killed. Again, the same kind of terrorist tactics. Michael told me in October 1976 that he would not live out the year. And 2 days after he told me that, he was assassinated. He was killed by a local white, then the state police came in and killed him. Then, in December of last year, this time last year, I received another phone call from the state police. My wife's cousin, 19-year-old Lynn Jackson, had disappeared. A lot of people thought he went AWOL because he was in the Army. But his tragic mistake was that he was going with a white girl. And his body was found 3 months later. He was lynched. We investigated. The coroner went out to see Lynn's body. He was found by 2 white hunters. He was 14 feet in the air, and the coroner said it was a suicide. So we organized people with the SCLC and other people to march, and we marched in the black community. Then about 3 weeks later, the Klan marched, had a bigger march than us, and they trashed the black community. Now, this is happening not in 1902, this is happening in 1982. This is happening now. Not just in Monroe, not just in Jackson, but across the South.
If you've grown up in the South, how would you appraise the differences between the South and the position of blacks in the South today from before?
The pattern of oppression is infinitely more sophisticated. That instead of a Bull Connor or a George Wallace who stands in the schoolhouse door, the system will find blacks who will carry out its own agenda, attacking the black community. It's what my wife would call a well-paid slave.
It's like they do in third world countries.
Oh, yes. You have in the South a number of black business people and religious leaders who basically have accepted the deal that Eddie Carthen turned down. In the state of Alabama, in the summer of 1982, a progressive white Democrat ran against George Wallace for governor. Wallace needed to win a fraction of the black vote in order to win the Democratic Party nomination. And so what happened? About 30% of the black voters cast ballots for Wallace, George Wallace, and he won by a very narrow margin. And the people who swung that fraction of the black vote were conservative rural black ministers who basically were on the take and tight with Wallace. And so for essentially their own personal aggrandizement, they sold out the interest of their community. I've seen this repeatedly, and I can't romanticize about the character of any community because, again, basic struggle are the struggles against our own weaknesses. These are realities that we have to deal with politically.
Dr. Marable, you are the director of Race Relations Institute at Fisk University, and I'd like to know what some of the issues and problems are on black campuses.
Well, I think that one of the basic problems that we run into is that the black college is now viewed by the bulk of American society as a social anachronism. Most black colleges were created during the period of Jim Crow racial segregation. In other words, white institutions were not created for black presence. That the black college is a product of white racism in a very direct sense. Now you have an interesting contradiction that emerges in the 1960s. You have the abandonment of Jim Crow. You have the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and 65 Voting Rights Act. So that the legal basis for separate and unequal has now been eradicated. Now, you have several contradictions here. First, these black colleges that were created, like Fisk University, where I teach, Howard University in Washington, the Atlanta University complex in Atlanta, Georgia, and many others, Prairie View in this state, these colleges, even though they were crippled because they always lacked the material resources, they did a remarkable job within their limitations of training several generations of black people in the humanities, the social sciences, and the natural sciences, and in technical fields as well. So that when you take a look, for example, even today, less than 25 or 28% rather of all blacks who attend college go to the 107 traditionally black colleges in this country, but something in excess of 42% of all black graduates every year come out of those schools. If you take a look at black doctors in this country, 75% of all black medical doctors have graduated from black institutions. 80% of all black dentists, 75% of all black attorneys come out of black institutions, and that's today. So what does it tell you about what these black schools are doing that is progressive? Now, what's happened? First, for black private schools, the federal government has reduced very significantly over the last 12 years the amount of soft money, that is, non-institutionally based money that comes in from the federal or state government, that goes to these schools, so that their programs have to be drastically cut. Tuitions for students at private institutions have gone up dramatically over the last 3 to 5 years. Many of these schools, such as Fisk, had tremendous operating deficits over the last 5 years and 10 years, so that every year they've had to dip into their endowment to pay off their operating costs. So that since 1969, Fisk's endowment has dropped from $14 million down to only $4 million. The number of students at Fisk have declined from 17 to 1,800 only 8 years ago down to 750. If we lose another 75 students, we're going to close. Other kinds of attacks at state schools are even more sophisticated. What happened in the 60s is that the doors were opened up for black educational opportunity at schools such as UT Austin, Dartmouth, Harvard, Smith College, Cornell University, where I taught prior to going to Fisk. What's happened in the last 5 years is that these doors are beginning to shut very rapidly, so that when you go to a school like the University of California at Berkeley, I've noticed that the black undergraduate and graduate enrollments since 1970 have declined by 300%. When I went to Cornell 5 years ago, there were almost 1,000 black undergrads and grads. Today there are only 625. When you go to a variety of white schools, you see not a greater number of blacks, but a lower number. Black institutions, on the other hand, are being liquidated. Many of the state schools, which were historically black, are now becoming majority white schools. I spoke recently at Kentucky State University in Frankfort, Kentucky. 10 years ago, it was 99.9999% black. Today, it is 48% black. I've seen West Virginia State, in the very southern tip of West Virginia, a historically black school, which is today 80% white. So the overall number of educational opportunities, because of desegregation and the way it has been applied, have actually diminished and not increased for black students. Black schools are being eradicated. The state schools are losing their money. The private schools are being forced into bankruptcy. And the federal government and so many progressives are doing nothing about it because they see this as an embarrassment. They see these institutions as living anachronisms that need to be forgotten about, without understanding that any kind of institution that black people create, be it in the era of segregation or since the civil rights movement, must be defended. And these are the kinds of issues we have to struggle with.
So what are some of the ways you see to defend the black institutions or to relieve some of these problems?
First and foremost, I would argue that black people need to, and progressive people, black or white, need to understand that the fight to maintain and to improve black colleges and universities is a critical struggle for black politics in the 1980s. It needs to be placed on the agenda. The second thing I would argue is that the only way that Fisk and other schools are going to be able to pull out their situation is from pressure on the federal government to really get into these schools and provide a material basis. For over 3 generations, these schools were the only things black people ever had. And now that the federal government has mandated a change in its national racial policy, they think that these schools can be just thrown out the window. I think that we have a political right to demand that these schools be maintained as historically black institutions, and also understanding, and this is not to take a position against desegregation. All I'm suggesting is, when I see the University of Alabama at Tuscaloosa have 30% black students, today it has about 3%. When it has 30% black students, then we can talk about Alabama A&M, which has 90% black students. Then we can talk about desegregating that school. But until I see good faith, say, from the University of Texas at Austin, I don't want to talk about Prairie View.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, there is an emerging theory that the significance of race is declining and class is considered to be the relevant factor. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Certainly. I think that one of the interesting dynamics of the 1960s was a kind of bifocal struggle about the centrality of race. The nationalists took the position that anything white was bad, okay? And you didn't want to have any parts of white people, all right? And so if you were going with a white person or married to a white person, or if, in one case, Huey P. Newton got in trouble over this. He opened a door for a white girl, and they had political struggles for like 2 months, right, around a serious contradiction. Right. So people fought over this question. And I don't mean to turn it into something that's light, because it was a serious question, you know, people dealt with. On the other hand, so much of what civil rights struggles was about was integration for its own sake. That is, the cultural abandonment of the ethnic heritage and the traditions of the black community by large elements of the black petty bourgeois strata or the black middle classes. Again, another classic June Marable story will suffice. When I was growing up, right, I used to be one of these Black Panther types. You know, I was too young to be in the Panthers, right, because I'm 32 now. But all of us had, you know, our leatherette jackets and our prescription sunglasses, and I had my little black tan, right? So my mother went to this cocktail party, right? And she was very pleased because she was the only one of the few black people in this all-white sorority. And to make a long story short, she came home at Christmas time from this big party, and she was crushed, just devastated. I said, "Mom, what happened? One of these white people said something to you, right?" She said, "Oh, Manning, it was so terrible. I went to this party, and it was so nice, and everyone was white. And then I sat down, and then it happened." I said, "What happened?" She said, "A black family came in, and they sat down beside us." said, Mom, what was the problem? Right? She said, well, they sat down beside us because they knew we were black. And I said, Mom, I've known that for years. So that there was a struggle around the race question. But what we didn't understand, well, what some social sciences have been putting forward recently, is that it's not a race question, that it's a class question. That it's really an economic thing, and that racism, that race as a category is insignificant. There is a declining significance of race. That's what some social scientists argue. My argument is that this is not a real argument. That the real question is, how do racism as systems and we could say classism, but I would prefer to call it by its real name, monopoly capitalism. How do capitalist structures and racist structures impact upon the majority of black people? And what we discover is not race or class, it's both. It's both. And there is no contradiction between that. There's no contradiction between saying patriarchy is a system that is interdependent with structures of capitalism. We can see this quite clearly in American society. The same thing is true for racism. That racism as a system is not racial prejudice or bad vibes. You just don't like black people because they're black for some metaphysical reason. Racism is a system that is rooted in the historic exploitation of black labor power and black political, cultural, and social life. And that in many ways it infuses with capitalism as a structure, but in other ways it is rather independent, okay, with it. So that when we say we oppose capitalism and we have to have a class struggle, that is not to say that we also are oblivious to race, because racism as a structure is as real as this wall back here, right?
Have we made real progress?
In relative terms, yes. In absolute terms, no. We won't have fundamental progress until everybody in this country goes to bed with a full stomach every night. And we won't have full progress until everybody who wants to work has a guaranteed income or a job. And we won't have fundamental progress until the great majority of our people control the mode of production, and that there is no racism in this country, that it becomes outlawed, and there is no institutionalized sexism in this country. Until we defeat those institutions, and until we have a true democracy in this country, a biracial and a non-sexist democracy, then fundamentally we will still not have progress. In relative terms, yes, but in fundamental terms, no.
Thank you.
Liza, any other questions?
Yeah, I'd like to ask, what type of advice would you give to young blacks besides staying in school?
Well, let me tell you, sister, one of the things I would say is that the biggest struggle that young people have to have, I think, is first and foremost understanding and internalizing their own history. I spoke in, here comes another story. I spoke in Providence, Rhode Island recently, and the black students who met me at the airport were really down. They came from Brown University. They said, Manning, something terrible has happened. I said, well, what's the deal? They said they went to this high school where a number of black students were in Providence, and they held a big Martin Luther King Day celebration. And the high school students came into the auditorium and they said, is that a picture of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? And the college student said, that's right. And then the high school student said, so this is for Martin Luther King Day? And the college student said, that's right. So some of the high school students said, well, is he coming? So what did the sister say? She said, I hope not. Right? So what I'm suggesting here is that we need to develop a very concrete notion of what history means. We've got a whole bunch of people who have never experienced, who are under the age of 20, who personally never experienced Jim Crow. Do you ever remember seeing the signs, black and white? Can you, at a personal level?
No.
No, okay. I remember as a kid going into clothing stores, and if I tried on a pair of white pants, pants in a white store, I would be killed. Or you use a bathroom that said whites only, you would be shot. And I think that that has a real impact on your personal development and on your politics. So that in a kind of perverse way, the absence of those kinds of legal structures or strictures against your humanity, in a real sense, desensitizes you to what the character of the struggle is. Because the system out here is every bit as racist as it was when they put up the sign. But with the sign down, people's guards drop. And they're not quite as aware of the need to understand their own history and the need to struggle. So I would argue that first, people need to really understand their history. Secondly, they need to be involved in a political organization at a grassroots level. I'm not here to tell people which one they ought to get involved in. Anything, as Malcolm used to say, that fights for black people's interests, that you can participate in, whatever it is, take part in it. And if it's not fighting for black liberation or black people's interests, then don't take part in it. So I would think that through the theory of study, and reflecting on our history and our past struggles, and the practice of being involved in a concrete program, whether it's voter education, whether it's voter registration, whether it's working with a community grassroots group, whether it's saving a black high school, whether it's holding a Black History Month celebration with black community kids, these kinds of political educational events help provide the practice for you that unites the theory. The theory and practice is what makes any kind of social change take place.
Do you see the movement as benefiting all minorities directly, indirectly, or do you see it benefiting the blacks primarily?
We need to develop political organizations and institutions which are predominantly, if not exclusively, black, which are grounded within the terrain of the black community, that fight for the community's interests. There are a variety of institutions that exist at a grassroots level. Many of them are all black. Many of them are multinational. But these institutions are also necessary as a part of the solution. I think that institutions that are independent of both the Democratic and Republican Party are absolutely vital to fight for black freedom and for the freedom and equality of all oppressed people. I think we need to go beyond the notion of coalitions, because all too often a coalition has been a very temporal thing based on immediate political expediency. I would like to see a common program which is comprised of what one political theorist, Andre Gores, calls non-reform reforms. A non-reform reform is a political reform that cannot be fully resolved within the framework of the existing political and economic system. It's those kinds of strategies, for example, strategies that constrict the right of capital to move from one state to the other. A strategy that says any plant that wants to close has to give workers a 2-year advance notice before it moves. And that if it does move, it has to pay taxes to the state and local government for a period of 5 years, same level of taxes, after it moves. Now, all of these kinds of reforms are not revolutionary, but they are reforms that can be won and are being won in some local areas that will restrict the prerogative of capital. And what we want to do is have capital have a hardening of the arteries. And in doing these kinds of strategies, we can, as black people, as women, as oppressed gays, as national minorities, as working people, trade unionists, as Native Americans, as Puerto Ricans and Chicanos, we can build an independent movement that is interdependent, that is a variety of social formations that agree to a common program which articulates a vision of society that can be fought for and won in the future. And by dialectically struggling in principal unity with each other, we can achieve that society.
That's Alternative Views for this evening. Alternative Views is a production of the Alternative Information Network. Good night.